Thank you to everybody who stayed this late at Republica to catch the talk. We're really happy to be here today with you. My name is Solana. I'm a writer and editor based here in Berlin, and I'll be your moderator today. And we're here to discuss something called the AI Commons, which means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and just like AI does. And to me, the AI Commons is not just one thing, but it's rather an approach to building and designing AI that lends from the practices of what we used to call, or still call, the digital commons. So if you think open data, open source, open knowledge, data sharing, these communities that create things on the internet, how do we bring that to AI? And the people on this panel belong to organizations and communities that are critical of how AI is being developed by big tech because of how it perpetuates inequities, because of how data workers are oppressed often, and because of how it fuels the climate crisis. But there are also people who are researching and building alternatives, which is why it's great that they're here to share what they've learned so far. And so the big question that I bring to you today is, how do we build sustainable, participatory, federated AI commons? And is this just a theoretical concept, or is this actually reality? Is this something we expect to see? And I'll start with you, Ramya. You're a lawyer and a researcher at the Center for Internet and Society at the CNRS in Paris. And you also work with the Open Knowledge Foundation and are a member of the Digital Commons Policy Council. What does AI Commons mean to you? And my understanding is that you're working on legal and governance strategies. And so when you're thinking about policies related to this question, to what extent are you thinking about governing something that doesn't exist or that might exist? And do you think that talking about rules of something that is still partly conceptual, could that even help unlock new opportunities for creativity and innovation?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for having us. I'll start maybe with what AI Commons means to me in the research. And in this regard, I rely on the work of Joanna Varon and others who came up with this concept of federated AI commons, which is the idea that you engage in AI development through sustainable ways and participative ways, so small task-specific models that are developed in decentralized federated ways with consensual data sharing practices, so community-driven data sets, and where you're constantly aware of the economic, social, and ecological impacts of any kind of AI development. And this framing is really important because a lot of the harms that we're seeing today are precisely on these three aspects. And a lot of those harms can be traced back to who is the one that's so active in model development today and how that's shaping the political economy of AI today. And those actors are largely big tech. So from that perspective, if I then turn to your second question in terms of what is the value of law, regulation, or even more broadly policy, when we're talking about the AI Commons. And I think there's two pieces to remember here. One is that the vision of the AI Commons relies on regulating the harms of today. From a legal perspective, that means regulating the harms of big tech AI development today in terms of the kinds of resources that they are monetizing and the ways in which they are, when it comes to data, especially gathering this data without respecting the wishes of communities and content creators. And the second aspect that I think is equally important, but perhaps not as discussed, because often we tend to think of the law as something that inhibits development or inhibits creativity, is that we can use the law to imagine and enact visions of AI commons. And we see that a lot with lots of new licensing initiatives, for instance, that have popped up in the AI context that are imagining and enacting new visions of reciprocity and shared values when it comes to creating data sets, maintaining those data sets, and stewarding them on behalf of communities, especially language communities. So,
yeah. Thank you. I'll go to you, Daniel. Daniel, you work for an arm of the German federal government called the GIZ that supports international development. And you're working on an initiative to democratize AI for local innovation with partner countries in Africa and in Asia. And I was wondering if you could share an example of something you're working on right now, and especially why. Like, what is really the problem when you have language models from Facebook or OpenAI that are so easy to use? Do governments really have to come in with their funding and reinvent the wheel? Yeah.
Thanks, Solana, and thanks everyone for sticking with us this late in the evening. I would maybe first start by giving a shout out to a colleague of mine, Deshni Govender, who is one of the instigators of the sessions and who unfortunately due to visa reasons couldn't make it here in time. She is our country focal point in South Africa. And to answer your first, well, partly second question, does it need government involvement or funding at all in this space? I mean, I would say the short answer is yes. And why that is, I think it's partly a question of who we want and how we want digital technology, especially now AI, to be controlled and governed in a way. Is that something that we want to leave to large tech private sector companies, or is it something where we want to maybe look at democratic means of control? And I think in that sense, that's where government can support. And when it comes to the comments, I mean, maybe briefly to build on what Ramya has said, I think one aspect that also relates to the example that I want to bring in is that it does not mean it's a free for all. Comments does not mean because it's open. I mean, you can discuss what openness means in the comments. It's not just free take for all. There's rules, there's regulations involved that are collectively created, agreed upon, on how to steward these comments, these AI comments, for instance, how to nourish them for the benefit of all who make use of them. The example that I want to bring in that sort of relates to that is work that we've been doing with the Mozilla Foundation, in particular with the Common Voice team. To those of you who don't know Common Voice, it's a platform by Mozilla to collectively crowdsource language data, text data and speech data to build language models in virtually any language. It is open source, and I think currently there's over 100 languages on it, and thousands of hours of language data have been collected, which is great, which is a great resource to build models specifically in languages that have been under-resourced. One of the largest data sets for some time has been in Kenya-Rwanda, which is the national language of Rwanda. Historically or traditionally, historically sounds like it's very old, but I think from the start, Common Voice started with a CC0 license, a Creative Commons 0 license, which is the license that's the most open license. So no guardrails, no conditions. Anyone can use the dataset for whatever purpose they want to use it, and that is good for accessibility. It's easy access. However, I think what Common Voice has realized and what we also realized in our work is that if you have such more radical openness, if I can call it that, it also opens up communities who donate, who give their data to exploitation. Especially if benefits that are generated through that data are not circling back to said communities. Language communities are one such example in the case of Common Voice, and that is why I think the Common Voice team, through conversations with different communities, have realized they need to do something about it, to look at alternative governance models for this data. And since the end of last year, we've been running a project in cooperation with the Mozilla Foundation, the Common Voice team, to explore different data governance frameworks. They started working in the beginning of this year with a community in Kenya, the Luo language community that has about 5 million speakers in Kenya, to explore what a different governance model, especially licensing, could look like. They've had a series of workshops to talk about AI, language AI, what it means to donate your language to a resource such as Common Voice. And then also to discuss licensing frameworks and governance mechanisms. And just now recently, I should add that this work is being done also with Dr. Lilian Wanzare, an NLP researcher at Maseno University in Kenya. And I think just a few weeks back, they decided to use a newly emerged license called the Nuolite Obodo Open Data License, or short Noodle, which was developed by a researcher in South Africa, the Data Science Law Lab, Professor Chijioke Okori, and Dr. Melissa Amino at the Center for I'm going to butcher this one, the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law in Kenya at Strathmore University. And it's essentially a license specifically developed for African language data sets to ensure that they are used in a way that is more, where the benefits that are generated out of these data sets circles back to communities. And what distinguishes them, sorry, this is a bit nerdy, but what distinguishes them, this license, from other licensees is that they have a geographic specification. So anyone from what they call quote-unquote developing nations, as defined by the World Bank, can use the licenses with a few restrictions, and any benefit generated from the use of that data set has to be reinvested to the data providers in agreement with the data providers. And yeah, I think this is where I believe our support could, I'm grateful that our support could help that work make
I'm glad that you brought up the distinction of it's not a free-for-all. It doesn't mean just that anybody can use it. And Ramya, you were also talking about rules, restrictions, licenses. And it's this funny dichotomy I think we have, especially with the AI topic, that we want more people to use it, but it has to be under certain terms. And part of what comes up in this commons approach or narrative of thinking about it is people coming together to make those rules together for themselves, for their own community. So you'll hear many big tech companies will use the word commons in different contexts. And I think when we were preparing for this talk, you've maybe heard of greenwashing as something that organizations do, but there's also such a thing as commons washing, and other kinds of open source washing is another term that we're familiar with. But I'll turn to Michelle, because you think about these topics a lot as well. You help lead an organization that's called the Green Web Foundation, which is working towards a fossil-free internet. And you also helped found something called the Green Screen Coalition, which is a coalition of funders and practitioners for digital rights and climate justice. And I suppose I would ask you, we've talked a little bit about what happens when you have people power, you have people come together to make rules for how you can do things differently or better or in ways that can benefit a community. But what do you see happening when private tech companies are the architects of their own ethics and sustainability standards? What do you think this people power brings to AI in your line of work?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we brought up the idea of open washing and also around the norms we need to govern the commons, because I've also been active in the open movement and I worked for Creative Commons for many years. And one of the most difficult things is actually to enforce these licenses, because there's so much innovation, communities determining how they want things to be governed, but then you basically have the not good kind of pirates coming in and closing on those commons or taking from it with impunity. And we're in a phase right now where we have the richest companies in the world, all with a platform of saying deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. Many of the leading governments in the world saying, great, we will deregulate for you. And we're kind of accelerating a situation where even though we might try to carve out these spaces, whether they're natural commons or digital knowledge commons, where we're trying to protect and do things with an alternative, we have very little ways to actually enforce those in a meaningful way. So I guess I'm very worried about that dynamic. And when I think about kind of my current activism, which is much more looking at the ecological impacts of these systems, we of course see the drive for AI accelerating the climate crisis on a lot of levels. And the companies also basically shrugging it off and saying, fire up the coal power plants, build nuclear, even though that's not even going to be a realistic solution for 10, 20 years. or even a solution we might want, and the government's just basically handing them out subsidies to do it. And so I think we're at this really critical moment where we cannot take the big providers of AI companies, we cannot take their pledges seriously. They've even backed away from their own climate pledges that they've set themselves and said in the era of AI they can't even meet their own sustainability goals, and those were voluntary goals that they put in place. And then the very bare minimum that we've had in terms of, in the EU, for example, to report on the impacts. We've seen that, yeah, as I mentioned, being deregulated. So we have these extremely wealthy companies with the regulatory capture of working with, with like heavy lobbying to basically be able to grow and scrape. And people like Mark Zuckerberg saying, yeah, more or less that we've pirated data to build these models. And I think this is the situation that we find ourselves in, and I guess I would be curious also how other people are dealing with this question of how do we truly build alternatives, how do we protect the spaces where we can build sustainably, mindfully, while also tackling the source of the power that's trying to disrupt and to undermine that while we're doing it. The dramatic noise was brought to you by the clanging plates. Yeah, I'll go back to you, Solana.
Yeah, if I could ask just a tiny follow-up question, because some of the organizing work that you've done as part of your organization, I mean, you're not just talking about carbon emissions, you're also talking about code, and you're talking about infrastructure in a way that I think really brings this down to the ground of, this isn't just ideas, this is really like a whole different way of thinking about how you build AI. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe if people in this room have been going to Republica regularly, I've also been here for many years, and I think for many years of being involved in these tech conversations, I maybe naively didn't think that the internet, or back then AI wasn't such a topic, but just that digital technology didn't really, it was immaterial. I think I internalized this idea that it was immaterial, and maybe there were some e-waste problems. Exactly. You're laughing because you know that we realized that was maybe a very naive position. But I think many of us who worked in free open source software or in other projects advocating for access to the internet and the kind of digitalization, we didn't take seriously the threats that this had to our natural world and of course to people, because there is also disproportionate harms happening to when we talk about how we have to mine the materials to make these devices, and then we have to power them, and where's that power coming from? It's still coming from fossil fuels, shocker. And actually we're seeing a shift away from, we were actually on some sort of decarbonization trend, and now thanks to AI we've basically seen those plans thrown out the window, and commitments to drill baby drill. And so I feel like this is actually a really important issue for technologists to really understand. When we talk about the tech supply chain, we don't just talk about software vendors, but we also have to really understand who are all the laborers in the supply chain, who make these devices, who make these services, who power them, who is being affected by that, who's benefiting from these systems. And those are questions that I think, unfortunately, in our activism, we've abstracted away, and we must pay attention to.
Thank you. Ramya, talking more about the material aspect of it, if you were to think from, let's say, majority world perspective, this concept of AI commons, or these opportunities afforded by AI commons, is it something that is urgent, or is it like a nice to have? Like, what is actually the urgency of working on some of these issues? Because it does seem like, is it a privileged conversation to even talk about this?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces here. So one, to the extent the majority world is the provider of raw materials to AI as it exists today, it is an urgent discussion. So in the context of language data, all of the, what do they call it, low-resourced language settings, and all of the knowledge that's scraped from these countries to make models perform better on benchmarks that are set by the global north, that is an urgent conversation. Same with all of the other material resources taken from the global south. And I think there, we really as a community, I think, need to come together to recognize that the law is a necessary restricting force, and that we need certain like hard regulations on these kinds of extraction that are being consistently undertaken by big tech. On the flip side, from the majority world, is the desire to build AI models something they should be doing in the first place? Is that an urgent conversation to have? I think that's a bit more complicated, right? So in the African continent, for instance, all of these really cool AI communities that have come up that are super bottom-up, like the Masakane community or Ghana NLP, I think they're great spaces. I'm glad that GIZ is funding some of their events, etc., because it allows people in these and communities in these majority world to kind of collectively think about building small models, what does that look like with their particular resourced contexts, etc. But in India, where I'm from, for instance, the hype of trying to build an LLM means that the Indian government now wants to build and train its own LLM, which is not a small task-specific model at all. It's another big model that's going to have all of the official Indian languages, which is a really small fraction of the number of languages we actually speak in India. And to expend already fraught resources in this agenda to just compete for the sake of competing, because like to build a new model is now sexy, you know, and like you want an Indian software engineer or like an Indian company to do it, for instance, which the Indian government will then use. This I don't think is urgent. So I feel like this piece on like should the majority world like care about AI, what should their response to AI be, I think is a bit more nuanced in terms of that, yeah.
Daniel, how would you assess something like that as an external funder who comes in as a partner on some of these projects? Like, what makes you look at a project that has an AI Commons perspective on it? And how do you assess whether something is sexy, cute, just like hype, or something that is really necessary and worth trying to make sustainable?
No, thanks. I think, I'm smiling because, as Rami has said, there's this hype around LLMs, and I feel like ever since ChatGPT has entered the market, everybody talks about LLMs, generative AI, and that almost leads to like a crisis of imagination. Like now everything is generative AI, and you have this big one-size-fits-all, model that uses up huge sums of energy, huge sums of water, huge sums of data, huge sums of money, and being applied to, I don't know, anyway. And I guess the challenge then is like what alternatives can we imagine? And I think from a funder's perspective, and I can't speak for all funders, and I can speak for the bit of the work that we do at Fair Forward. We're looking a little bit at, what firstly to listen and to see what's already there, because I think when we talk about alternatives to how AI is currently being developed, there are already alternative ecosystems that are emerging, that are burgeoning, that are, driven and run by actors like the Masakane Network, which is a Pan-African NLP researcher community, Ghana NLP. There's Lilapa AI in South Africa, Lesan AI in Ethiopia. Those are all sort of quote-unquote small-ish organizations, companies that work, in the case of language technology, on smaller models that don't use up as much data, that are for specific languages, that work on specific smaller tasks. And I think it's really important to look at these actors, to listen, not to assume that you know what they need, but to listen what their challenges are, and find out ways, explore ways to work together to support. It could be the support of networks, within countries, so to see what can you do to build, further strengthen networks. And we use the word ecosystem a lot, but AI ecosystems within countries, consisting of private sector, universities, also the government, of course, to support. But also regionally, because when you speak about languages cross borders. They don't stick to those largely colonially shaped borders. If you look at Kiswahili, for instance, it's spoken in at least 4 countries, and anything that you build, of course there's dialects, I need to add that, but still. So what you can do what is it that you as a funder, for instance, can do to support these kind of networked initiatives and not fall for like the shiny new thing? Because of course, transparently, every funder, every funding institution comes with interests. We at GIZ, we come with indicators and results matrices. Others come with log frames, and therefore accountability towards our commissioning party, which is our ministry. But at the same time, I think with every indicator that we have, there's also flexibility. And I would encourage everyone who is in a position to fund, also maybe with government funding, to look at that, to be in tune, to listen to actors like Masakane or other sectors that they may be working with, and find out what it is that they can support, to not fall for the shiny new thing just because it's called generative AI, and rather look at the power of having smaller, quote-unquote, smaller initiatives, and the power of them being networked, and a lot of initiatives doing a lot of great work, and then creating impact through that.
Thanks. I think in the popular conversation, a lot of people are aware of like writers complaining that their work is being taken, or artists, designers complaining that their work is being appropriated by large AI companies. Ramya, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what does that frustration look like from the community perspective of communities that are working on AI commons related things or open data challenges in the research that you've been doing. I mean, you've been thinking a lot about how do you do licensing, or what are the things that people would want to be able to unlock. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, just comparing from that conversation we know from the mainstream media to actually this seems like a niche issue, but I think it's probably pushing the envelope for a lot of the innovation that is going to be relevant in the larger conversation long term.
Yeah, so maybe I'll try and speak about three things that are very interrelated, but I think are interesting. And I think one piece definitely relates to the impacts of AI-enabled or AI-driven web scraping, and kind of what are the resistances to that, and what is the consequence of that resistance, which I think is really interesting. So I mean, a lot of, there is so much traffic to so much of the content hosted on the open web from bots that are like run by big AI developers just to scrape all of that content, that any other use of that service outside the bots is impossible, right? So you have like so many developers on GitHub trying to say that we are just overwhelmed with all of this bot traffic. It's taking away from anything else that we can do, because all our energies are invested in just trying to control the stem of these bots. And that has resulted in a lot of resistance from web owners, like website owners, to kind of like over-restrict what can and cannot be scraped from their websites. And this has really kind of sparked the conversation in terms of the siloization of the open web. Like, in the absence of any kind of standardization, be it legal or quasi-legal, in how you can indicate your preference for whether you want to be scraped or crawled or not, it may result in just different kinds of website owners coming up with different technical solutions that don't interoperate, and then kind of just destroy the promise of the open web, which was just this unbounded access to content on the open web. And I think this claim is being articulated in a lot of litigations that we're seeing around generative AI, where content creators, news companies, for instance, as well as open source coders who make openly licensed code available on GitHub, creative artists, authors, these are the people who are petitioning generative AI companies in courts. And this is one of the claims that they're making, to say that this kind of scraping violates like copyright. And the legal aspect there is interesting to see, but what's more interesting to see then is how do we recognize that the resistance they have to this scraping is valid, but we don't like over-regulate just to accommodate that resistance, right? And so like standard setting, which I see as kind of quasi-legal, is really useful here, or like new protocols that we develop for registering opt-outs, I think are really interesting. And I think we should think about a little bit more. And second, when it comes to licensing itself, and this is something I think I was telling some of you when we were speaking before, Creative Commons, when it came around, was really, really powerful because it subverted copyright on its head, right? Like it's based on this inverse logic that copyright was limiting the extent to which the creative industry could take pieces of creative content, remix them, put them together, and make like new art, new knowledge, etc. And Creative Commons just said, okay, if copyright law means that you can exclude somebody from using your resource, you can exclude nobody. So here's a license. That means nobody is excluded, do what you want. It doesn't mean you engage with fundamentally with the politics or the need for copyright, but it means that you just subvert it. And that was really freeing. It led to like lots of large repositories of content. It paved the way for like a big open access movement that kind of tagged itself to Creative Commons. An open government movement led to lots of different kinds of open government data sets being made that boosted a lot of accountability, transparency, anti-corruption efforts across the world, still does. And that's really cool. But there was always a politics to openness that I think is really stark now. And I think this is a moment to speak about that, which is that Creative Commons demanded openness from actors who were already aligned with the goal of wanting to like voluntarily share data and like be part of a sharing culture. It never demanded accountability from actors who just wanted to appropriate all of this openly licensed code and content and use it for proprietary business models, right? And this has been the challenge of openness. And I think with AI, this is playing out really starkly. Like you can take a piece of openly licensed code or openly licensed creative content, train an AI model out of it, and when it's generative AI, the law isn't even clear if the output violates copyright or not, if it matches the piece that you trained it on, which was copyrighted. And so in this kind of context, like maybe going back to the original logics of copyright doesn't make sense, but we shouldn't see this as a challenge. We should see this as an opportunity to think of openness beyond just the limits of copyright and to think of openness as something else. And what would that look like then? Where we learn from copyright, but we kind of move beyond copyright. And to me, that's the interesting thing to see, because all of the litigations, again, are primarily centered on copyright. So we'll have to see how this goes, but yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question of Michelle. We also have a question microphone in the middle of the room, and if you do have a question, you can stand in front of it and I'll call your name. Michelle, as somebody who's been involved in, I suppose, like online movements for change, like digital change, what kinds of people's movements do you think we need more of to push the change we want to see on AI and data for AI?
Yeah, and I was really resonating what you're saying, like let's reclaim the radical political nature of openness, because I think that could be a connective tissue to work with a lot of movements. And if we go back to also this question of what is the current AI hype and extractive model doing? It's challenging people's jobs. There's a lot of job insecurity. There's a lot of also just degrading of jobs. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to build movements with the labor movement, to build bridges with also laborers working across the tech supply chain often are also quite mistreated, and there's a huge demand, tech workers working in all sorts of roles to change the system. So working with labor, for sure working with the climate movement. There's some great talks. Beyond Fossil Fuels was just here giving a talk about also transitioning our data centers off of fossil fuels in Europe. There's a lot of organizing happening in Europe and beyond, connecting the dots between the drive to digitalization and unhealthy ecological practices. But one of the things we've learned in the work we did with the Green Screen Coalition is that there's kind of a blind spot that the climate and environmental groups have, which is they don't have the same analysis around why big tech, as what the bigness, why that's problematic, or why the monopoly, like the monopoly way of running your business is problematic. So we can bring a kind of digital rights lens to the conversation. And also because these AI companies are also co-opting like the COP proceedings where we're trying to meet Paris agreements, and they're kind of pushing AI as a climate solution. So there's a place where we can really work together, I think, with the climate and environmental movements, labor movements. And of course, every movement's for social justice, which is about orienting like a people-first and equitable way of building and deciding how technology is built or how our resources are allocated. And we're seeing a lot of erosion of that, including in Europe and in Germany, an erosion of freedom of expression, the ability to assemble and to, when we talk about languages, use our language and our voice to critique these systems. We're seeing increasing encroachments upon that, the criminalization of these things. So I think working with movements who also ensure that those rights are protected, because we're going to need all of us, right? In the end of the day, maybe that's the cheesy answer, but we're really going to need. We're fighting the wealthiest companies we've ever seen on this planet. And they are coordinated, they are wealthy, and they're not monolithic, they're not unstoppable, but they are very wealthy. And it's also teamed up with like private equity and consulting companies and government. It's a whole mega complex, but if we connect people, people-centered values, people-centered work, I think we can chip away at these things.
Yeah, what you mentioned around the intersection between labor or the intersection with the climate justice movement is something that I've thought about a lot too over the years. As somebody who's also been thinking about digital politics and digital rights, that, now it's not just internet for internet's sake or data for data's sake, or certainly not AI for AI's sake. And when we're talking about AI commons, often the types of projects that I think our panel would consider of value will often have an intersection with a community that has a genuine, actual material need or purpose or a meaning that goes beyond profit making for a corporate shareholder. I'm wondering, I'm wondering, Daniel, what are you excited to be working on in the next couple of years as part of the initiative? The FAIR, what is the acronym again? You have FAIR, artificial...
Fair Forward, and then the tagline is Artificial Intelligence for All. Mm-hmm. Our initiative in its current form at least is going to wind down mid-next year, but the work of supporting AI and also digital public goods or commons is going to continue even beyond Fair Forward. I think I mentioned this before a bit, but one aspect that I'm really excited about is this emergence of smaller models, or just the push for small language models, not the large language models, even though there's a lot of hype, a lot of funding, a lot of money going into LLMs, large language models, a lot of work. I almost see hackathons or like some initiatives every week that talk about fine-tuning LLM, choose one for a particular language, a particular task. And that might seem like a good idea from the outside, because then you make this LLM work in language X, domain Y, or topic Z. But in the end, you're supporting the companies that are developing these LLMs as opposed to other more localized or regional initiatives. So what I find particularly exciting, and what I hope will receive more funding, is the development of set smaller models and the infrastructure that those smaller models need, from the data, collecting the data that's required, to model development, because they require different model architectures, and there's a lot of innovation happening in research as well in that regard, through Masakan, who we already mentioned, through other organizations. And apologies, I'm only mentioning African ones. That's the area that I'm more familiar with. But also then looking at the application layer, looking at how can such models be made available and easily accessible, because I think one aspect of the business model that makes the models running ChatGPT so easily usable is because they're investing a lot of money into the APIs that make them really easily usable. I believe there's also push to have small pilots with said models, but then once you have to pay for the usage and scale whatever work you're doing, they become almost prohibitively expensive. So yeah, I would encourage anyone who can fund, whatever you're funding, ask the question, for whose benefit is this particular initiative that you're funding, and fund smaller models. Maybe I would also add one challenge is, of course, access to compute for AI developers, specifically those with less resources. And if that is something that that is something that funders can support, I believe, but also there one should look carefully. If you do that only through partnerships with AWS, with Google to provide credit, it's good for a time being because developers need that access to compute, but it does little for local sustainability. And it also depends on huge data centers that are, again, environmentally destructive and harmful. So what are alternatives to that? Maybe localized federated compute networks. Not everything has to run on 10,000 or I don't know how many GPUs the ChatGPT, the model that runs ChatGPT was built on. It's not required. One example is the community in New Zealand, Maori community around Tihiko Media. They built their own model, and I don't know if that's still the case, but I read a while back that they had one GPU or maybe two to train their models. So you can see like a small scale can do a lot, and those models that they've been doing in Maori, in their indigenous language, has had a lot of impact for that particular community. And I believe that is also possible elsewhere if we look at and carefully provide funding to support those activities.
Yeah, that's a very practical way of thinking about also what's necessary to bring this idea into reality. The fantasy of all these small communities all over the world making beautiful technology is sort of it's much more slow and difficult and hard to do in a sustainable way over a long time. And sometimes, I mean, even some of the projects that you mentioned, they have initial funding or support, and then eventually they run out of steam, and then they're there, and there's an open source community, but then who governs the data, who will maintain it long term? Like those are the next chapter of issues that we're going to have to start to deal with, is like the legacy of all these things that are created now in this period of creative innovation. But I wonder, Ramya, because we talked about intersection with climate justice, we talked about very briefly intersection with labor. I wonder if you had a perspective on intersection with human rights. I mean, human rights is an issue that comes up with big tech, but it also comes up with government use of AI. We've talked a bit about the positive uses of or influence of governance or governments on AI, but there's also a flip side of the coin. And I wonder if you could address that, but also think about, well, how can this AI Commons framework of thinking help in that regard?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Thank you. I haven't thought about this in so much detail, but I think the baseline, of course, is that there are harms that come from AI development, and there are some kinds of AI that are just outright harmful, right? So military use of AI, for instance, that we see increasingly, and that a lot of these big tech actors participate in and facilitate in conflict areas across the world. Facial recognition AI, for instance. I think there are huge human rights implications there, and there is a lot of organizing by human rights actors, Amnesty Tech, for instance, around curbing down the use of these kinds of models. And so there again, if human rights law is the strictest form of prohibitions on certain kinds of conduct, which is one of the original rationale of that body of law and the institutions that enforce it, then yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that human rights should be banning, for instance. Now, does this logic of like hard regulation and ban, does it align with a kind of more like soft philosophy of the commons, which is like everyone will come together and collaborate and have our own rules, there's going to be no top-down imposition of any kind of conduct? I mean, commons historically, any kinds of commons, while they come up with their own operational rules, of course, they're still subject to rule of law, right? So Wikipedia, for instance, is not a space where you can engage in harmful speech. It is moderated. At the same time, you still have to adhere to whatever rules of conduct that are rights-based in Wikipedia. So yeah, it's finding this balance, and like from a conceptual perspective, this piece has been studied and continues to be studied by commons researchers. This idea that common property resources have a certain bundle of rights, like you have a bundle of like who, in terms of who can access the resource, who can use the resource, who has to maintain the resource, who must give back to the maintenance of the resource, etc. And a human rights framing here could be really interesting, but this is, I'm not being very practical here, I'm being very like law nerdy here. But I think that's really interesting. But like, I think somewhere the discourse between the collaborative movement, which thinks that everything will happen organically bottom up, needs to come in conversation with a necessarily top-down like legal community that believes that some actions, even if community determined, are harmful and that they must be regulated. Those two are not mutually exclusive, but I think sometimes in discourse on the way these communities are set up, they seem to be mutually exclusive.
Thanks. I want to remind everybody that if you have a question, it can be a basic question or a philosophical question, you're welcome to stand in front of the microphone. You have a question? If you, then everybody can hear your question.
Thank you for these amazing discussions. I'm originally from Nepal. I'm studying here data science and public policy, and some of these conversations are really relevant to what I'm doing. I particularly feel like since the race on LLM and AI is emerging, and it has also impacted some lower income countries like mine in the global south, it's just that we have the existing digital infrastructure and the problem with the bureaucracy, and they are not even being able to reach the unreached, like the farmers who are utilizing this agricultural apps but they are not actually solving the problems. That's what I was doing research on. But at the same time, as I'm studying these new OpenAI models, especially now I'm focusing on politics, I do see that a lot of potentials in terms of classifying a lot of, for example, whether it's hate speech or whether it's political stance. I think we need to open up this OpenAI model, not open model, but it's just OpenAI or these large language models. And something like, as David, sorry, your name David, right?
Daniel.
Daniel mentioned about how lower income countries, even in the Africa, is producing a lot of small models. I think there should be, I'm in that position that it should be opened so that these countries or communities can try to have that semantic more match towards their own cultural and language nuances, but they should also be adhering, the regulation should be more on the application side, right? Not on the frontal side, but on the application side, because a lot of them are just opening, creating these models on the Hugging Face and not documenting it properly, just opening, doing this research for the sake of publishing or getting more like attention or something. So I think I'm in that position now. I wanted to get your perspective, like where should this regulation actually come in place, where these small nations should also come for their own agnostic, language agnostic principle, but at the same time also balance out their interest, right? So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. Do you have a perspective on this question?
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking. I mean, the work that you're doing is also happening in this like context of enormous amounts of innovation. Like, even though we're talking about low-income countries, we're talking about societies that have thousands of apps developed for phones and all kinds of innovations that are happening at the same time. And so I think what you were mentioning with the farmer apps, or I wonder if you thought about the work that you're doing in this like context of everything that's happening, and how these on-the-ground innovations around language, like how do they end up impacting the local ecosystem for like startups, or like how does it carry on into the private sector? I think that relates to the question.
No, thanks, Solana, and thanks for bringing that up. I think you touched on a lot of important points. I'll see if I remember all of them, but a few thoughts that I had while you were making your point was, I think one aspect that it relates to is this topic of digital sovereignty that's coming up again and again, and sovereignty meaning essentially democratic control over how digital technology is used in a specific country, and I think that should be something that is discussed, in that country. What mechanisms should be in place for that, and you also mentioned sort of transparency around OpenAI models or other LLMs, which I think, is absolutely crucial, because we do not know exactly what is in them. I mean, we know that there's copyrighted material in there, essentially stolen data. But more importantly, I think, so the approach that we take is to say, look, if you build resources that are openly accessible, such as data sets in low-resource languages, and make them easily accessible, then this is something that developers can take up, that researchers can take up to build novel models, and that essentially then also private sector companies, for instance, can take up, but also governments can take up to make services more accessible. So to build something that is not necessarily the application itself. And I'm saying that as someone who works for a funding agency for GIZ, and I know we also have a tendency sometimes to very much focus on the applications. That's why in some instances you have a lot of applications. There's an app for that. Essentially, pilotitis and all of that, which is not always helpful. In many cases, it can also be harmful, not only in terms of the users of said applications, but also in terms of binding funding that could go elsewhere. And to rather, why I'm making this point is to rather build and invest specifically when we talk about AI into AI commons resources that can help build ecosystems and look at the different layers. We talked a lot about the data layer, so and there I think there's quite a push also from funders to invest in building data sets. We also support a lot of data sets, but it can't stop there, because you also need to invest in model development. And then also support building applications, and I think Rami mentioned the point around not just support the initial funding or the piloting of something, but also think about the long-term maintenance. And I think the same is true when we think about AI commons related to data, to models, but also to compute. What can we do to support and fund compute networks, for instance, where there's no market incentive by private sector companies to fund that, but rather the role of public actors to come in and support that as public infrastructure. Sorry, I'm not sure if I touched on all of your points, but hopefully on a few of them.
To maybe build on that, I think it also is an invitation to us to expand our definition of innovation. So many governments and other, R&D departments have this narrow definition of innovation, which has to be technical innovation. And I think some of the things we're talking about also require social and organizational innovation. When we talk about how should the commons be governed, that's not a technical question. It's a social, organizational question. And so I think this is also an opportunity to expand what we mean by innovation, to uplift practices that might already be in place, where people, you mentioned the Nepalese farmers, might already be governing their commons or have ways of mediating and negotiating resource usage. So how can that innovation be strengthened and supported, and not necessarily putting a model on top of it if that's not needed? So that's also, I think, an opportunity for us to have this more expansive idea of what is innovation and what is a technology.
Actually, if I could make maybe a provocation, there is a lot of discussion these days and a lot of funding for making lots of different kinds of data sets and repositories AI ready. And so in India, for instance, that's translated to the government wanting to modernize its archives and its libraries, but modernize for the sake of making them annotated data sets or raw material for annotated data sets, not for the sake of preserving archives and libraries as commons or even as digital commons. And so somewhere in my head, I have this I'm unsure where this means. I know that adding AI gets you funding and can be used to support other kinds of digital commons resources, particularly from a maintenance phase, whose funding may have lapsed, like software commons or knowledge commons, for instance. But I don't want them to become funded just as raw material for more AI, even if that is small task-specific models. And I think this is, again, like one of those nuanced things that even I don't know how we make this claim of funders or governments, etc. To say that there are some things you must continue to fund and support because they are commons for the sake of those commons, not because they facilitate other kinds of commons, even if those other commons are AI commons, you know.
It would be last chance for somebody to ask a question. If you have one, you're welcome. Hi.
Hi, thanks. I'm Johanna. Thanks for this interesting discussion. I have a question from a quite other perspective, maybe. But since you touched upon also data for training, commons AI and AI commons and data sharing and so on, there was this discussion in my organization maybe 2 weeks ago about this treasure of data we have, like reports that are open access. And some colleagues said, hey, how do we actually prevent these like bad AI companies from using our data for training? And then the other colleague said, wait, but we want to have it like findable, accessible for all these good AI projects. And do you have any recommendations for organizations who are non-tech and are not really expert in this field, how they form their guidelines and how can they, I don't know, contribute to AI commons in a way, of data sharing?
I wonder if you would start with it, because it is something where, as Michelle was saying, it is a human issue of like, what rules do you even want to have in the first place? But then how do you scale it up? Like, how do you combine that with the technology that somehow pings all the robots to tell them exactly what they should be doing?
Oof,
Can you answer?
if I knew, I feel I would like have solved the world's problem, but no. I think, so I think when it comes to like, maybe if I make this specific, right? So as researchers, when we publish, when we put our work out there, like what do we want it to be used for? And what we're increasingly seeing is that like a lot of publishing happens via publishing houses, right? Like we publish for journals, we release data sets via repositories that are owned by actors, publishing houses that are making licensing agreements with AI developers. So all of our scientific work as researchers gets sold to AI companies as training data without us having any say, for instance. And I think at the first level as researchers, this is something to ask ourselves, right? Like, where do we want to put our work? Like, where do we want to publish it? Are there repositories? And there are a few. It's just harder to find than the journals that are better indexed, for instance, or the repositories that are more fair than the others in that sense. But it's something to ask ourselves, like, where do we want to publish? What kinds of repositories do we want to publish in, for instance? But the second piece in terms of like, because I think when you say fair, you mean like the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable standards, which are often attached to data sets, which is in the name of the project that you fund, for instance. And I think it's at the time in which when the FAIR standards came about, especially for scientific data, it was really, really important because like so much of scientific data was locked in all of these like institutional silos that many researchers were just reinventing the wheel at the data collection stage and not so much at the knowledge production stage. There was really no knowledge sharing happening. And so as we built kind of open access repositories, we also needed a way to make all of the data stored in those repositories kind of be able to talk to each other. And the FAIR standards are really crucial to be able to do that. It's been picked up for open government data sets as well. But I think they need to be supplemented with other careful measures. So within the scientific research community, the indigenous community has come up with the CARE standards to supplement the FAIR standards. That in addition to thinking of data sets as purely technical artifacts that must have these certain technical characteristics to make them interoperable, we must also think about kind of the labor that goes behind building the data sets, the kinds of knowledge that the data set encodes, for whose benefit is that data set and who makes these decisions. And you need to combine these two together. And I think as researchers, that's also something we should think about. That, of course, we create and produce a lot of knowledge, but what are we doing this for? Are we doing this just for ourselves? Or like, is there a larger social purpose that we would like to attach to the work that we're doing? And yeah, I think that's the way to go. Would you have anything to say on this?
I think we're even at the end of our panel. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to everybody who stayed and engaged. And please feel free to connect with us in the future.
Thank you very much, Solana Larsen and guests.